And I think that segues very nicely into the second part of our discussion, which is where we look at countries like Zimbabwe having a sudden change of heart. We have to ask ourselves, what are the reasons that where there was an ideological um, uh, basis behind these decisions that these types of contraception were being targeted towards particular racial categories. And then all of a sudden we see, for example, from a piece by Ritchie, who looks at Tanzania, for example, and who looks at this through a feminist lens. And we have another piece by Jacob Adetunji, who's looking in the context of what's happening in Nigeria. And he takes quite a pragmatic look at some of the reasons why. Perhaps many of them are health systems reasons. Some of them have to do with patient-centeredness, people's choices. And then again, a very critical piece by Matthew Cherzik in 2017, who traces the use of contraception in South Africa. And we also thought quite interestingly to include a piece in the Daily Vox that looks at the pricing of contraceptives and whether or not there are more cost-effective means of contraception or not. And if it is a question of cost, is that the reason why DEPO has remained so popular in many of these contexts? Could you perhaps talk a little bit more around these issues of effectiveness, safety, efficiency, quality, those kinds of issues that come out?
Of course. I'd actually like to start with the reading that you mentioned, second last, and then come back to the Ritchie and come back to maybe some of the issues around gender and power and South Africa a little bit later. The reason why we chose the Jacob Adetunji piece is that he's a scholar who has a strong background in West Africa, but he, for his research project, which he was doing on behalf of USAID and some Washington-based groups, he looked at the material and the data very extensively from East Africa too. So he really has quite a broad continental view, and he knows the literature from South Africa and from the United States well. And what he does in this piece, which is so interesting, is he says, look, if you look at the data, the use of DEPO is blossoming. It's burgeoning in places where it was banned, like Zimbabwe in 1981 when Robert Mugabe's regime came in, but also in countries that went through colonial transformation and revolution much earlier, like Tanzania, like Kenya, like countries in north of the Sahel. Why is it suddenly happening that this contraceptive is going from a usage of less than 1% to sometimes 2/3 of patient cover? It's targeted at women because men's bodies are not the receptacles of this contraceptive. It's often massified across vast regions. It's bought in big tranches, so logistically it can be mobilized around a country effectively. It's stable under different temperature conditions, and nurses and healthcare providers and clinicians across these countries are being trained to use it. So it's being placed in vertical programs. It's also being moved in rural areas into spaces where there is a primary care setting. And he asks why. And he says, look, on the one hand, it looks like it's a top-down decision. Governments have been persuaded, they've persuaded themselves that they have concerns around population growth and they wish to offer a solution that they feel is effective, that's cost effective, and that can be mobilized across different classes and groups. But then he looks at a second range of issues, and he says the idea that DEPO is deeply associated with colonial regimes or racist regimes has faded with time. New governments and new forms of clinical and demographic thinking have come back to DEPO again. And the reasons for this are not only top-down, they're also coming from the bottom up. And he postulates a number of hypotheses. And this is where we can read what he says, as you said, in a pragmatic population science methodology, alongside a feminist scholar such as Ritchie, who's also tried to probe and ask about why DEPO keeps bubbling up in societies all over the world. She comes from a background that looks at sort of international feminist studies of contraception as part of gender theory. And both of them bring to our attention the question of culture, the question of faith, the question of gender power in relationships. And using very different methodologies, the students will see they offer us evidence that women themselves are struggling to find equal relational bases for making fertility decisions in heterosexual relationships, whether it's in Canada or the United States or Central Europe, but particularly in developing countries in places like the Philippines, Southeast Asia, and South Africa, as well as in East and West Africa. Men and women do not have equal decision-making power in relationships. And men overwhelmingly have a huge negative reaction to planned contraception. This, ironically, does not lead men to use, for example, condoms, which they would control the use of. It results instead in many parts of Africa and the world in women taking on the burden of contraceptive choice and a kind of tacit silence beginning to emerge. And that's why injectable contraceptives are often preferred by women. Now, are they preferred in a completely autonomous ethical decision-making framework where everybody has equal power? No. Choice is made in very constrained conditions. So women, for example, will often choose the contraceptive that is least disruptive to the gender paradigm that they find themselves in for religious reasons, inside of a multi-generational family, and in complex relations around secrecy and trust in their own relationships. And it's this that countrywide or Department of Health decision-making matrices are tapping into, whether it's Tanzania or Zimbabwe or South Africa. So the students will remember the Kaufman when they come to these more recent readings, and they will see that Carol Kaufman and many others, including myself and many other health activists in South Africa, people such as Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma herself, who was South Africa's first health minister in Nelson Mandela's cabinet, we all were writing and thinking that Depo-Provera would be downgraded and would only become one of a range of contraceptives that would be offered in the new democratic South Africa, and that the pill, the IUD, barrier methods, men using condoms, vasectomies, women considering tubal ligation, that this whole other basket of care would emerge and would be offered to all South African women. But what we see as we come into the year 2000 and then all the way up the last 20 years is that Depo-Provera, as Matthew Chirzik et al. In their South African Medical Journal piece that came out in 2017, they show Depo-Provera is still the drug of choice. And we have to be very careful when we say choice, because it's always choice in context. There's evidence that women in South Africa are offered very little else when they go to health clinics. There's evidence that if you are a Black South African woman who has access to private care, if you go to a GP and you have private health insurance, you're very unlikely to use Depo. Your profile of contraceptive use will be much more similar to, and I'm sorry to use these apartheid era designations, but they still have a validity in our public health setting. Indian South African women, women of mixed background, and white South African women use Depo-Provera very seldom and often only when they have other health reasons to use it, for example, endometriosis. But overwhelmingly in South Africa, the majority of women, Black South African urban and rural women, use Depo. And it's become part of South African women's repertoire, their cultural experience of fertility control. And it goes back now 3 or 4 generations. So great-grandmothers, grandmothers, mothers, and now young women are all using Depo. Depo has become part of daily life. The risks associated with Depo have been balanced with other risks inside of communities. And it seems very, very difficult for us to unlock from Depo as a potential. And just as South Africa, South African activists and others are questioning this, and South African health scientists are returning to the literature and to the bench science again and saying, are the burdens of Depo, are the side effects of Depo actually too much to bear? Just as we are questioning this, so countries in our region are taking up Depo at a very, very rapid pace. So these readings in this cluster give students a very nuanced perspective. The risks and the benefits associated with Depo, there are public health issues, there are biological and physical issues, there are gender relationship issues, there are issues of cost, there are issues of equity. The Daily Vox piece is an excellent and very, very brief summary of the cost of all the different contraceptive options in South Africa as of 2.5 years ago. And as the students will see, Depo is not expensive, but it's also not the cheapest option. So in every single one of those readings, the students will find a place to debate what is the efficacy of Depo and how do I measure it against that steep modality, and think myself as a young health system scientist about why Depo is still so widely used in South Africa.